You know, son, you're not a kid anymore.
Oh, no, I go to
shows.
Dad, I already know all this stuff.
Well, they don't teach you about everything
At shows.
Okay, Mr. Smartypants? So just listen. When boys and girls get a little older, they start getting
Interested in punk and hardcore subgenres. Starter kit.
Yeah, so first off, I want to say that there's a great podcast called End on End that it's where they talk about the Discord catalog from number one to whatever they end up at. And I've guest hosted on some of those episodes. So we have actually talked about some of the records I'm going to talk about now on that podcast. But so Revolution Summer is sort of like third grade for the DC punk scene. You know, if like first grade is the Slicky Boys, and then maybe there's a grade in between. I don't know, like a 1.5 grade that could be Bad Brains and Teen Idols. And then you've got this explosion pretty much I attributed to Minor Threat and Discord Records being like the second grade, like the establishment of like, we're hardcore. This is hardcore music. And then around 83, a lot of these bands start breaking up and a lot of suburban kids start coming into the scene, and the scene gets much bigger and much more violent. There's a big skinhead contingent happening in DC around that time, and Minor Threat breaks up. The Faith breaks up. The Faith at the very end put out an EP called Subject to Change, which at this point they're a 5-piece, and it's much more melodic than the record before that, the Void Faith Split. And so their two guitarists at this point are Eddie Janey, who just joins the band at the very end, and then the original guitarist of the band, who was in SOA before that, whose name is Mike Hampton. I don't know why I was spacing on his name. He's a Facebook friend of mine. Sorry, Mike Hampton. You won't be listening to this anyway. So Mike Hampton and Eddie Janey are sort of like the architects of the guitar sound that would be Revolution Summer, because Eddie Janey forms Rites of Spring in 84 with Guy Picoccio and Brendan Canny, future members of Fugazi. And then Mike Hampton forms Embrace with Ian MacKaye. So there's sort of like a musical chairs going on in the scene. And so this new generation of bands starting around 84, 85 are much more emotional sounding and more melodic sounding than the stuff that came before them in general. And so Amy Pickering, who's someone in the DC punk scene, she's like bored at her, government internship or whatever. And she starts creating ransom note letters that talk about like Revolution Summer's coming. And she mails these letters anonymously to anyone in the punk scene whose address she has. And she looks back on this as like, kind of an embarrassment. Like, God, that was so corny to do. But the term Revolution Summer sticks. And so that's kind of cool. Like how many eras of a scene actually have a name associated with them? Not that many. Summer of Love, Summer 67 in San Francisco being one of them. So Revolution Summer is the summer of 85 in DC, and Rites of Spring's LP comes out, which is a big deal. This is a band that we're going to talk about them a little bit later, but they are super volatile. Like if you went to see them play, there is a good chance every instrument would be broken by the end of the set, and not like we're upset, so we're going to smash all our equipment. It's more like we're just completely like unhinged. And it's sort of like they were emotional, but not mopey. So they would jump around a lot and just give it 1,000% until there was nothing left. And the cool thing about the album is they recorded it that way too. Guitar, bass, and drums recorded live, and they had a strobe light on in the studio, and they're just jumping around, just going nuts the entire time. And then somehow it doesn't sound like a total train wreck, which is unbelievable. I'd be so sketched out in a recording studio. I'm like a statue. I'm like trying to make sure I hit every note on every string correctly. And then so Embrace comes not that much longer later, maybe sometime in 85 they form. And so this is essentially the original lineup of the Faith, with Ian MacKaye singing instead of his younger brother Alec, who was the singer of the Faith. And Embrace, there's almost like there's a stern vibe to them. It's like Ian is super pissed off. He's just as emotional as Guy is in Rites of Spring, but it's a different kind of emotion. It's more of a I'm so sick of what's going on around me, and I'm just going to tell you in plain English what I think is wrong. And so they record an album in 86, kind of after they decide they've broken up, after only playing, I don't know, a handful of shows, 10 or so. And then that album doesn't come out until 87. So I picked For Want Of by Rites of Spring and Dance of Days by Embrace. And then there's another band, Grey Matter, which is ex-members of Iron Cross, and they put out an album in 85 called Food for Thought. And they're sort of like, they're like kids who grew up playing music together, a lot of them. And the drummer's father actually owns a restaurant called Food for Thought, where a lot of these early like Revolution Summer style shows start happening towards the end of 84. And Grey Matter's sort of like, I want to say they have more of a 60s influence, because another thing is a lot of these bands, they worship the Beatles, even though you don't really hear the Beatles in their music. There is a somewhat of a 60s garage rock vibe, especially with Grey Matter, I feel. And so after that LP comes out, they put out an EP on Discord called Take It Back. And it's very apparent that Rites of Spring have influenced Grey Matter. So now they're starting to sound more like what we think of as a Revolution Summer band. And so I picked Chutes and Ladders, which is the first song off the Take It Back EP. And then for the final, and then there's a couple more songs I picked for the starter kit. One is, what was that, Zach?
Oh, I just wanted to jump in and clarify. Everyone, there's a playlist for every episode, so you can go to 185milesouth.com, click that playlist link at the top of the page. Ben's laying out this oral history of the Revolution Summer, but he also chose some choice tracks, so you can have a soundtrack to this starter kit. So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about the songs that he chose.
Yeah, and so musically, I think the biggest outlier of this whole scene is Beefeater, who Thomas Squibb, who is I believe a Swiss immigrant who was the drummer of Red Sea, who is on the Flex Your Head comp from 82. He is the singer of this band, and they're kind of like a funk punk band. And they form around the same time as the Red Hot Chili Peppers, but on a separate coast, and I don't think they were aware of each other at all until they were completely established and probably had records out. But the thing about Beefeater is they had an album from 85 called Plays for Lovers, and then and that was on Discord, and then they leave Discord and they put out an EP called Need a Job on some label called Olive Tree Records, and then they come back for a final LP on Discord called House Burning Down, and the song I picked, Just Things, is the first track on House Burning Down, and you'll hear what they call the introlude, which is Ian MacKaye thanking you for purchasing this hardcore product, a pretty tongue-in-cheek thing from Ian. And this is like, I'm not that much of a fan of Beefeater, but I really like this one song. And I don't know. I mean, Zach, like, you'd never heard this before. We make fun of like funky bands, but like, I don't know why, there's something about this song that I dig. What'd you think of it?
I mean, it's like so in your face and wild that I think that maybe just as a side note, it's kind of fun. It's interesting because it's so ridiculous, right? Because we hate like funk bass. We make fun of the Red Hot Chili Peppers being like the worst band in the world. And here's a band that, like, if you aren't aware of them, they sound like, I mean, it sounds like Fleas in the band, you know? So it's entertaining, that aspect. The thing about this song is they have like this middle part in the song where it gets all spacey and it's super rad. Like they create this style of music that is like really cool, I think. And then they just go back to funk and it's like, oh man, you know, so there's something creative and interesting going in here. I think that, you know, just to listen to one track, it definitely keeps you on your toes. But yeah, do I like it? No, it's terrible.
Yeah, I like it.
Pops, what's your take on this song?
Well, I was going through like all their tunes because there's just so many like curveballs in their discography, and I'm terrible with song titles, but there's that one that like Tomas sings. It's like an acoustic track that's really pretty. It sounds like it could be like on a 60s record. It doesn't make any sense. And then they'll go into like, they have a couple sort of ripper tracks that sound like Bad Brains that like tone the funk down. But it's like Zach said, the funk, when they lean into that, it's so in your face that it's like hard to separate. But I do like this track. It's fun. Like it's super bouncy. And I think like a good way to look at what they introduced was like, you know, they're obviously like this, they had this vegetarian message that was a big deal, this spiritual message, this protest message, and they kind of approached the band as more like an art project, which it's not the newest thing, but it's pretty new to introduce that into, you know, on the heels of like the bands that had broken up in 1983. So I think like, I just think of them as a band that was aware of this entire aesthetic, and that is, it had a lot of influence on other DC bands to think outside the box and think of their band as a project rather than just a collection of songs or a style of music. And I think that gets a little lost.
So is that the approach though, that they're trying to not have like themselves be a cohesive band at all? You know, I think of, you know, something like the Minutemen where they can go off like in any direction. It's like, we're not tied to a style.
I think that's part of it, because I might be wrong. I believe it was around this time or maybe a little before, a little after, where they first introduced this idea that Ian had called Grand Union, where they were just going to get up and have different ensembles all the time and incorporate everyone from the scene. So I think like that was a bubbling idea to really get out of these molds, you know?
I think that's a success. Ben, do you want to talk Soulside?
Yeah. So Soulside started as a band called Lunch Meat with umlauts over the U in Lunch Meat, and they changed their name at some point, probably because Lunch Meat with umlauts over the U is like the worst fucking name any band could ever be. But before doing that, they put out a split 7-inch with the band Mission Impossible, and that was 85. Yeah, so that was Revolution Summer. And
but Ben, how about the 2020s when the band Tupperware comes along? They're like, I'll see your lunch meat and give you a container to put it in and ace your worst band name.
Yeah, but does Tupperware have umlauts over the U? I don't think so. But this split 7-inch is, by my estimation, not very memorable. The most significant thing about it is the drummer of Mission Impossible is Dave Grohl, and this is the first record he ever appears on. And once Lunch Meat becomes Soulside, the following year they record their first album, Less Deep Inside Keeps, for Ian MacKay's younger sister, Amanda MacKay's record label, Sandwich Records. And they're still trying to find their sound. I'm a big fan of this record. The song I picked is I Find the Other Side because it shows up later on the it's like a single, I think. A live version of the same song shows up later on one of their records.
Yeah,
So
the bass 7-inch.
yeah, Bass 103 Other Side, yeah, 89. So this band is, I'm trying to think, Bobby Sullivan is a nice guy by all accounts, open-minded dude's got white guy with dreadlocks, which is pretty uncommon for the 80s. You see that a lot more in the 90s. The Soulside were not stuck up about playing with like rev bands and straight like youth crew bands. Like if you look at a lot of those flyers from the late 80s, there'll be like a bunch of youth crew bands with Soulside on the bill. And whereas if you look at some of the other Discord gigographies, like there are bands who like manage to avoid ever playing a show with any like, X on the Hands, Hooded Sweatshirt type bands. So I think that's cool that Soulside were, pretty open-minded about that shit. But they're very melodic. They're very much in that right there in the ballpark of Revolution Summer style music, which I think of as a few attributes would be like melodic bass lines, a lot of stuff on the bass played on the D and the G string, and you hear a lot of regular ass hardcore where like the bass player never even touches those top two strings. And the other thing for the guitar is you have a lot of chords but with like open notes ringing out above them. Like Dag Nasty does that a lot too. And like the reason I didn't include Dag Nasty in this is because they themselves thought the idea of Revolution Summer was kind of silly. And it needs to be said that there are bands from that previous generation that stick around into this era, and like Government Issue and Scream, who they're not technically Revolution Summer bands. I'm using air quotes right now. You have to take my word for it. But like they still, like these bands still play shows together. But you can understand how maybe an older band might be like, Revolution Summer, what's this nonsense? But the thing is, that era of music was at the same time very melodic, very arty, and very political, which is kind of a combination you don't see too much of. Like usually the evolution of a scene would be like super hard and fast and political. Then it gets like arty and melodic and alt rocky, and then the politics kind of start fading away, and it kind of went in the opposite direction for DC. And then you have, even though we're past the summer of 85, you have bands forming like Fire Party. Amy Pickering, the person who coined the phrase Revolution Summer, she starts a band that she is the singer of called Fire Party. Ignition, which is Alec Mackay's next band, and Rain is another band. So these bands have that sound, even though they didn't technically exist in the summer of 85. So I think the whole vibe and feel and sound of the scene lasts kind of up to about 89. I'd say that's when Soulside breaks up. Embrace breaks up 86. Rites of Spring breaks up 86. Gray Matter breaks up 86. Beefeater maybe makes it to like 87, maybe even 80, maybe 86 for them too. Whatever, somewhere around there, 87. So these are it's a very short-lived scene with a handful of bands who don't last very long, but they leave a huge impression. And one of the biggest legacies, and I think it's the dreaded E word is connected to this scene. Like the first time any band's referred to as emo or emo core, I believe, is either Embrace or Rites of Spring. And there's a video of Embrace playing in 86, and Ian MacKay's making a speech about what is this emo shit? Like the comedian Emo Phillips, like he's already disowning it. And then I'm not positive about when the first bands come along that self-identify as emo, when it is not a dirty word, but that happens well after this, I think. And there is definitely a musical influence with early proper capital E emo bands going back to these type of bands. And it's like, come on, dude, Rites of Spring is so original and so different sounding than anything before it. And one of their trademarks is how emotional they are, that like, I hate to say it, but the term emo core is like, it's like fitting. Like if you came up with another term, like I invite anyone to come up with a better term to describe Rites of Spring or that specific sound. I don't know. We just call it Revolution Summer now because that's kind of the term that got thrown around at the time.
I think something that, like, to build off that, I think there's some kind of interesting things happening here that get glossed over because of the emo word. And I'm fairly sure, I obviously could be wrong, which is why I said I'm fairly sure, but it might have even been Pusshead who reviewed Rites of Spring or Embrace and called it emo core and thrasher, and it would track that a journalist would do that, right? Like come up with the term. But I think in going back and listening to, like, I listened to all these records, not just like the one track, and you can make an argument the Rites of Spring record is the hardest record. And even as, you know, Guy has said this, that he wasn't doing an emo band, he was reinterpreting hardcore. And I think it's kind of cool if you look, all these records, you know, save well, actually no, all of them have black and white covers, and they go back. And I know, like, I'm not saying there was like a concerted effort, you know, like it wasn't like, oh, we're gonna go back to looking like Crass or something like that. But it's this weird mashup of like things are artier, but they're still kind of like very direct and primal, just with like a little bit of a more artistic touch, but they're still really messy. It's not like these records look like they're going to come out on major labels. And I think because of like, we look everything through this emo scheme, we kind of forget that the music is still super aggressive. Even like Embrace is a weird one because the music's so melodic, but then Ian's like cutting that with so much screaming. And I think it's what you're seeing is the idea of emo is that you can have aggressive vocals that aren't really overdriven music. And that's just kind of it stylistically. And then also this allusion to like, oh, okay, we're not just going to put a, you know, like a photo of like some terrible thing that happened in the world and photocopy it and put our, you know, logo over and stencil letters. It's like just a little more, you know, just introspective, I guess. But the other thing I wanted to add is like, it's pretty amazing, short-lived thing. There's a lot of, they're taking the music out of the clubs and doing these drum protests, these punk percussion protests, and, you know, speaking out, like really mobilizing around apartheid. And it's cool that they didn't keep it insular, right? That they were over the idea of preaching to the converted. So I think that's like really important that they took punk, and because it was getting so violent, they opened it up to other people with other ideas, you know, rather than like, you know, you're probably not going to sit around and bang a drum and change any skinhead's mind. So maybe you could do it in a more communal setting and bring people into the scene and add more creatives. So I think that's cool. And then the worst part about it, he'll never hear this podcast, I bet, is that Dave Grohl somehow has a hand in yet another thing in the world, and it has to be something so cool. Oh well.
Yeah, and it's kind of the first thing he had a hand in, which is like, it's strange. I don't want to say it's heartbreaking. It's strange, but the other thing about,
and to expand on that and keep it on Dave Grohl real quick. You know, you said that Scream was not a part of this, but their sound does change on the '86 album, which I believe is the one where Dave Grohl comes in, right? Doesn't he play on Bang the Drum?
No, he comes in the one after that. I think he might join the band around '87, but he's not on a record until '88. He's not on a record until No More Censorship. But you're right, their sound does change. You're right.
Right. Yeah.
They're like, them and Government Issue are the ones that get out there the most. And there's always this like, I mean, we can make an assumption, but as bands start touring, for the most part, like especially back then, their sound suddenly changes, you know, and like that was Dag Nasty's thing of why they weren't playing. They were like how they thought Revolution Summer was silly because they thought it was too insular, and they wanted to go tour and just be a band, not part of this like this scene or whatever. And they did go out and tour, and that was something that was not typical for a lot of the Discord bands, with Scream being like the big exception, and Bad Brains. But now I'm just fuck, dude. I'm thinking like Dave Grohl is kind of like the weird. He's obviously incredibly talented drummer, but he's almost like the Forrest Gump of punk rock and music.
Absolutely.
But okay, but then elaborate for me, because maybe this whiffed over my head. Outside of playing in the band that was on the split 7-inch, what is his big hand in this?
Oh, he ends up
I don't
in
think it's-
Scream.
Yeah, but later, and he said they weren't a part of it.
Well, I also said that even though the bands that came before the summer of '85 and didn't consider themselves a part of it were still in the scene and still played with these bands. You know?
For sure. Yeah,
you know, there's a lot of teams that win a World Series and you don't remember who was on the bench. You know what I mean? It's like he still gets a ring. You know what I mean?
No, for sure. One other thing I just wanted to mention real quick, Ben, before I shoot it back to you, is you said that this stretches out through '89, and we should just mention that the first Fugazi record comes out in '88, so they kind of carry it along with them.
Well, they're kind of the culmination of this whole thing, because you have the two big bands, Embrace and Rites of Spring, and the singers of those bands combining forces to do a band with two lead singers, and that's Fugazi. So it's sort of like almost like a pyramid, where Fugazi's at the top of the pyramid and like everything else is like leading up to that point. Even though I will say I actually enjoy these bands more than I enjoy Fugazi. I think there's something a little bit more primal and sort of I guess rough around the edges than Fugazi. But what I want to say about what Pop said about like opening things up and starting like legit protests in front of the Capitol building and maybe broadening their horizons. At the same time, I think Revolution Summer, there is a degree of elitism to it, because it's a scene within a scene where the intent is, what kind of music can we make that like skinhead tough guys, scumbags who come to our shows and ruin it for everybody will hate? Like we can't get rid of these people, but maybe if we play music that is, you know, in such a way that they just don't want to come to the shows in the first place, then we've won. And so I think that might have actually happened. That might be that their strategy might have worked. I can't imagine too many. I'm sure there were a handful of skinheads at Rites of Spring shows starting shit, but by and large, I think the strategy might have paid off.
So here's a weird question, or it's just a question, and maybe Ben, you could kind of speak to it. The punk percussion protests, right? If you think about these bands, like you think of where, when Guy and Ian form Fugazi, it's not really what anyone expects. It doesn't sound like an amalgamation of like their bands before, because Fugazi is just very like influenced by reggae, influenced by ruts. They're very percussive, right? The bass is so prominent. Soulside ends up changing, and they're more in this percussive thing. Beefeater is a very percussive band. I would really be curious. I guess it's not a question to you because you can't answer it, but I wonder if that percussion, ensemble idea influenced the bands going forward, and if anyone there would be like, yeah, that did open our eyes up to these other rhythms, because it's kind of like a hallmark of 90s DC, is that it goes away from a lot of pop structure and it gets a little more rhythmic.
Yeah, you get bands like Lungfish, who are hyper repetitious. It's like the same 5-minute song with that's one part, and which drives me nuts, by the way. And like Fugazi is as repetitious as I can handle. Jawbox as well. Soulside definitely changes once they get Johnny Temple on bass on the second album. They definitely get more Fugazi-ish right around the time Fugazi puts out their first album. So it's kind of like a chicken or the egg question, like who was really playing that exact style first between those two bands. But I guess you could say that's probably the end then of the beginning of the end of this sound, of this kind of mid 80s DC melodic, but you still have, the drums are bashing away. If you isolated the drum tracks on any one of these records, not including Beefeater, who are funky, it's basic punk music. And then Fugazi, you don't have Fugazi, by the way, the drummer is Brendan Canny of Rites of Spring. It's almost like he's done playing punk music for the most part. It's like, okay, I've played like a fast 4/4 beat enough. Time to do something else. It's like you would never guess it was the same guy. I'd never guess.
Let's jump into the music of Rise of Spring and Embrace when we do the next segment. But Pops, can you give your take on the Gray Matter song?
I'm a huge Gray Matter fan. It was I was trying to articulate the way that they're poppy, that it's not it's not really even power pop. It is that like 60s influence, probably, guys who really liked Nuggets records and stuff like that, and really warm but still like fun and energetic and not overly sweet. And I loved Gray Matter and 3 and Senator Flux, and just like anything kind of related to that type of songwriting, the players who were in those bands. But yeah, I think if we weren't attaching this word emo to it, we're like, oh, that's just a super great melodic punk record. It's still, it's almost like the brand outshines how great some of the music is. And Gray Matter is one that I think people should go back to if they like anything, really melodic without being too. And I think the difference is they're not like anthemic. They don't have these payoffs of some big gang vocal or something that might sound a little more British. It's still it really is an amalgamation of like the punk that some people claim started in the 60s, more modernized for the time or something.
I think it's kind of unfair that emo gets attached to this stuff, because Gray Matter and Rise of Spring, like, they low-key kick ass. Like, I think if the emo thing's attached, it must just be to the vocals. But even then, it's not that it's emo in the way that a lot of people think of emo as a negative. Like, there's just a vulnerability in the voice, maybe. But
Well,
I
and
don't
the
know.
lyrics too. The lyrics are much more introspective than, Dead Kennedy's Frankenchrist, which came out in 85 as well. For example, I just pulled that out of my ass. But like, there's definitely a lyrical shift with these bands.
Fair. Totally
Like,
fair.
if we were like, here's a good way to look at it. I don't know. Think of like what's the most emo-y like band in the 90s? Like, say, Promise Ring, right? That's an example, or just one, right? Promise Ring. And then think of like the first Drive Like Jehu record. The first Drive Like Jehu record is just like the aesthetic of it, and aside from the length of some of the songs, it bears a lot more in common with Rites of Spring than Promise Ring do. It's like this really, and Rick Froberg is like a huge fan of Rites of Spring, and it's like, or maybe even like, I think less Pitchfork because of Rites of Spring. I mean, Jehu's like so mangled, but the idea of like these screaming vocals, the music can be angular. It's super direct at times, and it can go out. Like, even Rites of Spring had parts that go out, but I think that's the misnomer, because I mean, and this is no offense to the Promise Ring. I'm sure, people in that band loved Rites of Spring, but to me, it doesn't come out in a lot of the things that get called emo at all. Like, I don't really see the threads in any of this stuff if I really like zoom out.
No, we're missing whatever. If this is 1 and Promise Ring is 2, we're missing the 1.5 of emo. Ben, where are you?
The 1.5 of emo is Moss Icon, who were a late 80s, early 90s Maryland, close enough to DC band. I think they were from Annapolis, which is very close to DC. Definitely, I think.
But they even started in '86. I mean, I guess they are kind of they're 1.5, but they're still starting like on the heels of, what I mean?
Yeah, and they're bringing that sound into the early 90s. They're absolutely like the connection between like the early 90s like emo bands where all the records are in manila envelopes and hand stamped and shit, And
Yeah, but musically, are they boring?
well, musically, they range. There's a huge amount of range. There are like really like beautiful kind of promise ringy parts of songs. I'm so bad with song titles, but I can think of like, I have like a guitar line going in my head right now, one of their songs. And then they have like really raging punk songs. So even within that band, you see that the progression from like the raging punk of Rites of Spring to the what people call twinkle core, whatever the fuck, like braid style 90s emo, Midwest
Yeah, they
emo.
also introduce like the talkie singing on some songs that you hear in like a lot of those bands, or like Native Knot or something like that. The only thing that's like the big difference with them is they were huge post punk fans, and they were as much as into like Joy Division, which would become an influence later. Where like I don't think Braid's influenced by Joy Division. They're also just this very odd. They almost feel like an odd band that existed in their own little sphere. But yeah, I think that makes sense calling them the bridge, because they tread these two worlds of like the quieter stuff and then the stuff that would be called screamo, that was like part of the Gravity scene. So
I'd be curious to know.
That's a really good bridge.
I'd also be curious to know if any of these Revolution Summer bands were aware at the time of the band Squirrel Bait, who were from Louisville, Kentucky, and doing something very similar at the exact same time. And those guys ended up forming Slint later on. But Squirrel Bait is like, they're the closest thing to Rites of Spring outside of DC, I think. They're not as good. I don't think they're as good, but very similar vibe and everything, energy. What do you think of that, Pops?
No, I can't think of anything else that fits in that zone. I guess the only other thing, and they're more like closer to Husker Du, would be the Hated. And
yeah,
I was only thinking of that because I guess Numero Group's about to reissue everything they've ever done or something. So, and that's again but that band, they were like another band in a bubble. Like that sort of pocket is very weird. But yeah, Squirrel Bait's that's a good analog.
Yeah,
Pops,
and I
can you
tried
speak
to.
on the Soul Side song before we get out of here?
Oh yeah, I love that Soul Side song. It's pretty much their most melodic song. Their catchiest, maybe most straightforward song. I like where they went later on rhythmically, but I mean that song's a ripper. That's kind of like remain their theme song no matter what.
Ben, is there anything else you want to touch on here? I think that you did a great job, but this is a pretty gnarly thing to sum up, in 10 minutes or whatever you did. So anything else you want to speak on it? And Pops, anything else you want to jump in on?
I'm trying to cram in like 10 episodes of End on End, and their episodes are like 3.5 hours long each. So that's like 30 hours of stuff in 30 minutes. But I say just listen to the playlist. I tried to keep it bands that actually existed in 85 to keep it as strict as possible to the definition. But if you like that shit, just follow Discord up to the end of the 80s and you're going to find a lot more stuff that sounds like this. Fire Party, Ignition, Rain. Rain wasn't really on Discord, but they had members in common with a lot of these bands.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is I don't know if the book's in print, but if you can find a copy of Mark Anderson's Dance of Days, there's a lot of info about this stuff, and I just went back to it, and it's really cool. Like, our memories are a very tricky thing. Like, I'll be listening to a podcast, and I'll be like, oh my God, I didn't know that thing. And then I'm going back, rereading that book. I'm like, oh, he mapped it all out. I just forgot. So if you can find that text, I don't know if it's in print, definitely worth picking up.
To end on this, like, what do you think the legacy of this is? Because we're talking about not seeing like a straight line to like the 90s emo and where emo would go beyond that. Like, is it just to Fugazi and then whatever Fugazi influences, or where does this lead us, and what is the lasting legacy, Ben?
I think it's not so much what the legacy of this is. It's more like DC was far more documented than other punk scenes because they had, documentarian minded people like Ian MacKaye doing the deed in real time. And it's just like it seems like every scene sort of has this trajectory, like this lifespan where kids just learning how to play their instruments get together, form bands, the scene starts, they get better at their instruments, more people come into the scene because the music gets better, and then at some point it becomes impersonal, and there are factors that people are not, negative elements that creep into the scene, whether they be violence or heroin addiction. I didn't touch on that, but that was a big thing. And then there's sort of like a reset button that a lot of scenes go through. And so the cool thing about Revolution Summer is it's like probably the most well documented punk scene is DC, and so you get to see, up to the month, like how these people are handling these issues that every scene goes through. I think, like if you look at LA and all the violence and all the wackiness that happened, or LA's an older scene, so it would have been like we would have gotten stuff like Into the Unknown and Beneath the Shadows, like bands doing weird stuff as almost like a reaction, or like Black Flag slowing down to a crawl. Like it's just that cool like next step of a scene where it's like we can't just play like 4 chords really fast for the rest of our lives. We'll die of boredom, and the people slamming to them we hate these people anyway. So I just think it's like a cool, like, it's like a case study of what happens next. No pun intended.
And it's kind of interesting in that way too, right? Because so many of these early DC hardcore bands, when they start, like the people are legit kids, and I think that this stuff is interesting because a lot of the key players, they don't drop out after a couple years when they mature. Like they stay punk and they do other impressive bands,
One thing I'll add is that I think what they did, if we're like, for me to try to sum it up, it's just to show that a scene can react to itself in a positive way and create something different. Like it doesn't have to be whatever, the scene isn't dictated by just the booking agents or the people coming to the shows. And to kind of like bring a little, I don't know, I guess like personal experience into it. I remember when, not exactly when he moved, but I remember that Bobby Sullivan had gone to college and moved to Boston. And he had such an impact on a certain part of the hardcore scene that was starting to fragment, where like people were getting sick of like the tough guy stuff in Boston, the violence in Boston. And they were incorporating, like he was working with Food Not Bombs, and Food Not Bombs would come to shows, and we were just, people were distributing food, and starting to, that parlayed into doing shows in this co-op market, and like this whole other, not parallel scene, just like a totally different scene. And that was like where a lot of bands that like Converge would play a lot of those shows, and they were more of like a political band, or maybe not political, but they were more of like a less of a metalcore band at the time. And Piebald would play those shows. And then we're also, bands like if Rye Coalition came to town, they would play those shows rather than, the club shows. And that sort of idea that you can have ownership of the scene, and I think that's really powerful, and I think that's being replicated in different ways today. It's just about like, it's really this almost an OG idea of creating a safe space.
Pops, can you give a ballpark time frame of when you're talking about that happening in Boston?
Yeah, so that's Bobby had moved there, I believe, in the 80s. Bobby Sullivan from Soulside, or maybe 90, because then he started joined this band 7 League Boots. But this is about starting from 90 and then getting full on by 90, like about 90, 91, 92. There was this place, House of Borax, and where it was a DIY loft space where like Born Against, Rorschach, bands like that would play. And then that generation kind of phased out, moved away, and then younger people took it over, specifically a lot of younger women. And that extended, I would say, into the mid 90s. So there's like a couple different times, but they're really like the peak of like that next DIY generation was started in '93.
So rad. Closing thoughts, Ben.
Yeah.
It really only takes 12 people, well, maybe 16 people to start completely turn a scene around, because 3-4 bands, 4 people in each band, actually less than that, because you can share members with people in multiple bands. So a scene is really just 3 or 4 bands in a venue or 2.
Well, and people to fucking show up and pay at the door. Let's not forget about the people that really make it happen.
You're right. People have to care. That's why you got to be good.
That's
When you
right.
start a band, be good. These bands are really good.
Yeah. Pops, you got closing thoughts?
Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention to buy a book that is in print, Banned in D.C. by Cynthia Connolly. And I don't have anything further to add on what, and they ended up calling Degradation Winter.
Right on. Right on.